Some women carry murder in their hands without knowing it, and some women know exactly what they carry and pour the tea regardless. Miss Jane Marple, stepping down from the 4:15 train at the small Wiltshire station of Marsham Breddy on a cold afternoon in late September of 1964, did not yet know which sort of woman she was about to meet. She knew only that the air smelt of wood smoke and turned earth, that her friend Edith's cottage was a half-mile walk through the village, and that she had brought, in her small leather case, 3 balls of pale blue knitting wool and a sense, light, not yet pressing, that a fortnight in someone else's village would do her good. Welcome back to Marple Mysteries, where the kettles boil quietly and the secrets, less quietly, come to the surface. Settle in. Pour something warm. This is a story about a tea room, a returning woman, and a death that the village will at first call a misfortune. By the end, you will see, as Miss Marple sees, that misfortunes of this particular shape almost never arrive without a hand behind them. The station was scarcely a station, a single platform. A wooden shelter painted the green of every country halt in England, and a station master who touched his cap to Miss Marple and asked after her case as though he had been expecting her. He had been. Edith Pelham had written to him personally, in the way of widows who still believed that the world worked best when one knew the names of one's intermediaries. Mrs. Pelham said, "You'd be on the 4:15, miss. Shall I send the case up after, or would you rather carry it yourself?" "I shall carry it, thank you. It is very light. I do not bring much." She did not, in fact, bring much. A grey wool dress and a brown one, her good cardigan, 2 pairs of stockings she had darned herself rather than buying new, because the darning was a satisfaction in itself. A Bible she rarely opened, but liked the weight of, in her case, 3 balls of wool. The half-finished bed jacket she was knitting for Edith as a recovery gift, and a notebook in which she occasionally wrote down things that struck her, observations about people, mostly, which she would later find she had remembered without needing to consult the notebook at all. The walk from the station took her past the War Memorial, the post office, the church, St. Bartholomew's, late Perpendicular, with a yew that Edith had once told her was older than the parish, and along the high street toward the tea room that sat at the bend of the road where the old mill had stood until 1908. The tea room was painted cream with green window frames, even at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, past the hour when most country tea rooms had begun the small rituals of closing. Its windows were warmly lit, and a few figures could be seen at the tables inside. Miss Marple, who had not yet been to Edith's cottage and was not expected for another half-hour, allowed herself the small indulgence of going in. The bell above the door gave its little domestic note. A girl of perhaps 18, in a pale apron, looked up from wiping a table and smiled with the open, slightly distracted warmth of a person who had been polite since 7 that morning. "Tea, miss? I was just thinking of stopping the urn, but Mrs. Quinton wouldn't hear of it if there's a customer. A pot, please. China, if you have it. And whatever is fresh, I am not particular. There's a Madeira cake still, made this morning. Then a slice of that." Miss Marple sat by the window. The tea room was the kind of room that had been arranged by a woman who understood, without ever having read a word on the subject, that a place which feeds people must give them somewhere to put their elbows and somewhere to rest their eyes. The tables were small and round, the chairs slightly mismatched in a way that did not feel careless. There was a long shelf behind the counter on which jars stood in a row. Quince, blackberry, damson, marrow ginger, a praline of some kind in a smaller jar at the end. A range, polished to within an inch of its life, glowed quietly along the back wall. The smell was of butter and warm sugar, and a thin top note of something Miss Marple could not at once place. Something green, perhaps a herb being dried somewhere out of sight. The proprietress came through from the kitchen with the pot herself. She was a small, neat woman of around 50, with grey-blonde hair pinned back without fuss, a clean apron, and an expression of such settled composure that Miss Marple registered it before she registered the woman's features. Some women in late middle age wear composure as an exhausted achievement. This woman wore it as though she had laid it down beside her bed the previous night, picked it up that morning, and put it on like a familiar coat. "Miss Marple, is it?" she said, setting down the pot. "Mrs. Pelham told me you'd be coming. She rang through yesterday. She thought you might call in. I'm Sylvia Quinton. How kind of her. And how kind of you to be expecting me." "Not at all. We're a small village. We do tend to know who's coming." She poured the first cup herself, with the small attentiveness of a woman who had poured perhaps 200,000 cups of tea in her life, and still cared about the angle. Then she said, "I'll let you sit. The cake will be just a moment." She went back through to the kitchen. Miss Marple watched her go and thought, without quite knowing why she thought it, of Mrs. Halloway in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Halloway, the dressmaker, who had made her sister-in-law's wedding dress with such beautiful patience, fitting after fitting, year on year, the small sounds of pins between her teeth, the thought passed. The tea was excellent. The Madeira cake, when it arrived, was perfectly made. Miss Marple ate slowly and listened, as she always listened in unfamiliar rooms. Not for anything in particular, but for the rhythm of the place. The way the door opened and the way it closed, the small conversations between the girl Annie and a woman who came in to collect a parcel of buns. The absence of any clock ticking, which meant the clock above the counter, was a very good one indeed. It was nearly 6 when she rose to leave. Sylvia Quinton came out from the kitchen to see her to the door, and as Miss Marple thanked her, the tea-room proprietress said, "If you find yourself at a loose end on Saturday, do come to the harvest tea. We hold it here every year for the church roof. It's a small thing, but the village rather likes it. I shall, if I may. You'd be very welcome, Miss Marple." The door closed behind her with its small bell, and Miss Marple walked out into the dimming afternoon toward Edith's cottage, with the taste of butter still on her tongue, and somewhere beneath that, the first faint, unanalyzed sense, no more than a tilt of the inner ear, that the woman she had just left had been entirely calm in a way that calm women, in her experience, were not. She did not yet know that Helena Marsden had returned to the village 6 months previously, after 30 years away. Edith would tell her that an hour later, over the second cup of tea of Miss Marple's evening. But that comes in the next part of our story. Until then, keep the kettle on, and remember, in a village like Marsham Bredy, the warmest room is often the one you should watch the most carefully. Edith Pelham's cottage stood at the far end of Church Lane, behind a low wall of Cotswold stone that had been there longer than the cottage itself. By the time Miss Marple pushed open the gate, the dusk had turned the colour of weak tea, and the lamp in Edith's parlour window threw a square of warm yellow onto the path. The door opened before Miss Marple could knock. "Jane, my dear, come in out of the cold. You walked from the station, didn't you? You always do, you ridiculous woman. Mrs. Bunting has made up the back bedroom, and there is soup." Edith Pelham, 71, leaned on a stick now and would for the rest of her life, but she had lost none of the bright, slightly imperious warmth that had once made her the head girl of the small Hampshire boarding school where she and Miss Marple had briefly overlapped 60 years before. She kissed Miss Marple on both cheeks, a continental affectation she had picked up in the 20s and never relinquished, and steered her into the parlour where a fire was burning, and the soup, as promised, was on a tray beside the better armchair. They did not, that first evening, talk of anything pressing. Edith asked, after Miss Marple's nephew Raymond and his wife, after the vicarage at St. Mary Mead, after the new young curate Miss Marple had mentioned in her last letter. Miss Marple asked after Edith's hip, which was healing, and after Edith's elder son in Canada, who wrote rarely but well. The clock on the mantel struck 7, then 8. The soup was eaten, the tray taken away by the silent and capable Mrs. Bunting, and a second pot of tea brought in. It was over this second pot, when both women had settled into the particular conversational rhythm of long friendship resumed, that Edith said with the small lift of pleasure she always gave to a piece of news she had been saving, "You will find the village interesting, I think, Jane. We have had a return." "A return?" "Helena Marsden, the schoolmaster's daughter. She left in. Oh, it must have been 1934, the autumn of. She is back. She has been back since April, in fact. Old Miss Marsden's cottage came to her when the aunt died last winter, and she has done it up rather nicely and means to stay. And the village receives her." "The village," said Edith, "is divided. The older ones remember her. There was a small fuss when she left. Major Henshaw, you will meet him, was rather involved at the time, though one is not supposed to know that. His wife knew. She died 6 years ago, poor thing. And Beatrice Drake, who was Helena's closest friend, has not exchanged more than a courteous good morning with her since she came back. The younger ones know her only as a well-dressed woman from Eastbourne, with a slightly foreign way of carrying herself, which they put down to her years abroad. Cape Town, I gather, and then Nairobi, and then the South Coast. She has done well for herself in her quiet way. What sort of woman is she? Edith considered. Composed, polite. She does not gossip. She is rather watchful. I do not mean unpleasantly so, only that one has the sense she is taking the measure of the village as much as the village is taking the measure of her, which is fair enough after 30 years. She comes to church. She has been to the tea room a number of times, I am told. She takes her tea black with lemon, which Sylvia Quinton has had to special order, since no one else in Marsham Breddy drinks it that way. Miss Marple did not at once say anything. She was thinking of the composed woman she had seen that afternoon, pouring tea behind the counter of the old mill, and of the small jar of praline at the end of the shelf. "There is one other thing," Edith said, with a faint note of something half curious and half disapproving. "She has had a London solicitor down twice. In those legal envelopes one cannot mistake. Mrs. Paget at the post office mentioned it. One does not know why a woman returning to her aunt's cottage should require a London man, when there is a perfectly good Wiltshire firm in Salisbury. But there it is. Helena always did prefer to do things her own way." "How interesting," said Miss Marple, and meant it. She slept that night in the back bedroom, under an eiderdown of considerable age and excellent insulating power, and she dreamed, briefly and without troubling herself about it on waking, of a row of glass jars on a shelf. On Sunday morning the bells of St. Bartholomew's rang Miss Marple awake at 10:15, and by 11 she was sitting in Edith's pew, third from the front, on the left, where the Pelhams had sat, since the Pelhams had been anybody, observing the village of Marsham Breddy at its weekly self-display. The Reverend James Coombe was young, 34, with the slightly anxious shoulders of a man not yet quite sure that his sermons were landing. He preached well enough on the parable of the sower, with 2 illustrations from his time as a curate in Hull, and 1 apology for the length of the 3rd hymn. Miss Marple liked him at once. He had the particular quality, rare among curates, of looking at his congregation rather than past them. She catalogued, as the service moved through its familiar rhythm, the figures she had been told to expect. Major Roland Henshaw in the front pew on the right, large and red-faced, with the small wet mouth of a man who liked his luncheon claret. He sang loudly and slightly off the note. There was, when one was downwind of him, as one filed out for communion, a faint smell about him that was not unpleasant, but was distinct, wax and paper, very faintly burned. Miss Marple noted it without analysing it, in the way one notes that a particular dog is in the room without thinking further about the dog. Mrs. Beatrice Drake, 2 pews behind the Major, 63, straight-backed, with iron-grey hair, under a hat that had been expensive in 1953, and was being worn now with the particular pride of a woman who did not replace things merely because they had aged. She wore gloves. She wore gloves in church, which was not unusual. But Miss Marple saw, when Mrs. Drake reached for her prayer book, that she also wore them under her gloves. A thin pair of cotton inner gloves, the kind one wore for a skin complaint. Both pairs stayed on throughout the service. Miss Marple registered this and stored it. Dr. Edmund Hargreaves, alone in a pew toward the back, 62, with the somewhat collapsed posture of a man who had not slept well. He did not sing. He stood and sat at the right moments, but with a half-beat's delay. Miss Marple, who had observed many widowers, recognized the particular weariness. She also recognized, more privately, a small thing in the set of his hands. A faint tremor when he reached for the hymnal. That suggested he might have had something in his coffee that morning that had not been coffee. Mrs. Paget, the postmistress, in a brown coat, third pew from the back, her eyes moving more than her head, and at the very back, slightly apart, Helena Marsden. Miss Marple looked at her with the careful sidelong attention one gave to a stranger in a small room. Helena was 58, slim, with the kind of bone structure that did not soften with age, but only became more clearly itself. She wore a dark grey wool dress and a brooch of jet at the throat. Her hair was pinned back in the style of women who had stopped following fashion 30 years before and had decided not to start again. She sang the hymns from memory, without the book, in a clear, low voice that did not draw attention to itself. She did not look about. She did not appear to be aware of being looked at, though Miss Marple noted that she certainly was. After the service, the village reassembled itself on the path between the church door and the lich gate, where the curate stood shaking hands. Miss Marple was introduced by Edith, who had walked slowly down on her stick, to a small succession of villagers, each of whom said how pleased they were and how Edith had been so looking forward to her visit. Major Henshaw, when his turn came, took Miss Marple's hand in his large one and held it a moment longer than necessary, in the way of men who had been gallant in 1925 and saw no reason to update the gesture. "Charmed, Miss Marple. Edith has spoken of you. You must come up to the Grange one afternoon. I keep an excellent sherry. How very kind." Mrs. Drake's greeting was cooler, a slight inclination of the head, a "Miss Marple, welcome to Marsham Bredy," and the gloved hand, when Miss Marple shook it, was firm and slightly stiff inside the cotton. It was only as Miss Marple was turning to leave the churchyard with Edith that she saw, near the lich gate, the Reverend Coombe Bay speaking to Helena Marsden. Helena was nodding, smiling a little. The curate said something that made her laugh, a small, real laugh, and at that moment Miss Marple saw, very clearly, the woman Helena must have been at 25. The structure of the face was the same. The laugh would have been the same. The young men of Marsham Bredy in 1933 would have had no chance at all. Then Helena turned to go, and the village turned with her, in the small, invisible way villages do. The heads not quite swivelling, the conversations not quite breaking off, but every person on the path aware, for the half-second of her passing, of exactly where she was. That afternoon Edith was tired, and Miss Marple, after settling her in the parlour with a rug and a novel, walked back into the village alone. The tea-room on a Sunday afternoon was at its busiest. Annie was carrying 3 plates at once. Sylvia Quinton stood behind the counter pouring from the large pot, her sleeves turned back precisely 2 folds at the wrist, her face flushed lightly from the warmth of the urn. But otherwise, Miss Marple noted again, entirely composed. Miss Marple took a small table by the window. Most of the church congregation seemed to have come on. The Major was in the corner with 2 other men over a teapot and a plate of fruit-cake. Dr. Hargreaves was alone with the Times. Beatrice Drake had not come, and Mrs. Paget was at a table with her sister. Helena Marsden came in at 3:20. She crossed to the counter, without looking about her, and Miss Marple, who was very near the counter, and had her tea in front of her, and a slice of seed cake she was eating with deliberate slowness, heard the exchange clearly. "Mrs. Quinton, a pot, please, and a scone, the plain today." "Of course, Miss Marsden, with cream. Just butter, thank you. It will be a moment. The fresh batch is just out of the oven." Helena nodded and stepped back, and her eye fell on the row of jars on the shelf. "You have a praline now, I see, for the harvest tea on Saturday. A special scone, chestnut and praline. We have done a different special each year for 3 years. Last year was fig and walnut, the year before was lavender and lemon. And the praline, almond?" "Almond," said Sylvia Quinton, and smiled. "I know your difficulty, Miss Marsden. I would not put a peanut anywhere near my kitchen." Helena returned the smile. "How kind of you to remember." "One does remember in a village. One does." Helena went to her table. Sylvia turned to the urn. Miss Marple, eating her seed cake, did not look at either of them, but she had heard the exchange, and she had seen the jar on the shelf, and she had seen, though she would not be able to say so for many days yet, the very slight, very brief steadiness of Sylvia Quinton's hands as she had said the word peanut. It was the steadiness of a hand that has practised a sentence many times before saying it aloud. Miss Marple finished her tea. She paid Annie at the counter, complimented the seed cake to Sylvia, and stepped out into the lane. The afternoon had turned colder. She walked back toward Edith's, past the War Memorial and the post office, and the dark windows of the houses, whose owners were still drinking their Sunday tea. She thought, vaguely, and without yet attaching the thought to anything in particular, of how often in her life she had watched a small village arrange itself around a returning figure, and of how rarely the arrangement was as casual as it appeared. That, however, is for the next part of our story. In Marsham Bredy, the week was only just beginning, and the harvest tea was still 6 days away. The parish council of Marsham Bredy met on the second Tuesday of every month in the village hall, a low brick building behind the church that smelt always of furniture polish and faintly of damp. Miss Marple, who had no business being there, attended as Edith's proxy. Edith was on the council in name, and had been for 15 years. And her hip would not at present carry her the half-mile, and the curate had suggested, gently, with the small diplomatic touch that Miss Marple was coming to admire in him, that perhaps Mrs. Pelham's guest might sit in and report back. The council had agreed. Miss Marple had thanked them by letter. On the Tuesday evening, in her good grey wool, she walked down to the hall and took the chair nearest the door. The council numbered 7. Major Henshaw chaired. Beatrice Drake sat at his right hand and took the minutes in a small decisive script. Dr. Hargreaves was a member, though he attended only when nothing else claimed him. He was there that night, slightly red about the eyes. The Reverend Coombe sat ex officio. There were 2 farmers, Mr. Loft, Annie's uncle, and Mr. Brisley, and a Mr. Ferris from the larger of the 2 outlying houses, who said little and looked at his watch often. The business was small. Repairs to the Lich Gate. A complaint about the bus from Salisbury arriving at the village 10 minutes later than its published time. The harvest tea on Saturday, which Mrs. Drake reported was on course, with the takings to go to the church roof as usual. The Major nodded at each item and moved each one forward, with the cheerful, slightly impatient firmness of a man who liked meetings to end before 9. It was during the third item, the bus, that Miss Marple, sitting near the Major, caught again the faint smell she had noticed on Sunday. Wax and paper, very faintly burned. It was not a smell of furniture polish, which was the smell of the hall itself. It was closer to the smell of a hearth that had recently received a small private fire. She did not at once think anything of it. She filed it. Mrs. Drake, taking the minutes, wore her gloves. She removed the outer pair to write, and kept the cotton inner ones on. Miss Marple, who had a clear view of her hands across the table, observed that the cotton at the knuckles was very slightly discoloured. Not dirt, but the faint yellowish staining that ointment leaves on white cotton after a long evening. She filed that too. The meeting closed at 20 to 9. The Major rose with relief. The curate gathered his papers, and Beatrice Drake said, without looking up from the minutes, "Major, a word about the flowers for Saturday. I think the chrysanthemums are wrong. They will overpower the room." "My dear Mrs. Drake, the chrysanthemums were your idea last year. Last year the tea-room was less crowded. I have spoken to Mrs. Quinton. She agrees." "Then I bow," said the Major, with a small mock courtly gesture, "to the women of the village, as I do in most things." It was said lightly. Mrs. Drake did not smile. She closed the minute book with a small dry sound and rose. Miss Marple, watching this very small exchange, observed that the Major's eye, after the joke, had moved to Mrs. Drake's face for a half-second longer than necessary, and that what was in it was not flirtation, but something nearer to wariness. Two people who had known each other 30 years, and were not, on the whole, easy with each other. Outside the hall the air had sharpened to true autumn cold. The curate fell in beside Miss Marple and walked her as far as the Lich Gate, talking easily about the harvest tea and his hope that the new tenor in the choir would not, as he put it, go his own way again on the second verse. At the gate he wished her good night. She continued, up Church Lane alone. She passed the tea-room on her way back. She had not meant to stop, but the lamp in the front window was on, and the door was on the latch, and through the glass she could see Sylvia Quinton sitting at the back table, the one nearest the kitchen, where the staff took their breaks, with the lamp turned low and a cup in front of her. She was not drinking from the cup. She was not reading. She was sitting with her hands folded on the table and looking at the row of jars on the shelf. Miss Marple stood on the pavement opposite for perhaps 10 seconds. The tea-room should have been closed. It was nearly 9 o'clock. The closed sign had been turned in the door. Sylvia Quinton sat alone in her own tea-room, in the dim lamplight, looking at her preserves. A figure stepped out from the side passage of the tea-room and crossed the lane toward Miss Marple. It was a young man, 26 or 7, in a town overcoat. A clerk's coat, Miss Marple thought, not a country one. He carried a small case. He saw Miss Marple and touched his hat. "Evening, ma'am. I'm sorry, did I startle you? I'm just down for the night to see my mother. She's the proprietress." "Mr. Quinton? Daniel Quinton, yes. You must be Mrs. Pelham's friend. Mother mentioned you'd been in. Miss Marple, how do you do?" They shook hands in the lane. Daniel Quinton had his mother's small frame and her grey-blue eyes, but where her composure was settled, his was uneasy. He glanced back at the tier-room window, and then at Miss Marple, and Miss Marple saw, very clearly in the lamp spill from the doorway, the particular expression of a grown son who is worried about a parent and has nobody he can mention it to. "She's quite well," Miss Marple said, with the soft conversational lift that invited but did not press. "Oh, yes, she is well. She works too hard, of course. The tier-room is a great deal for one woman. I tell her every visit she should take an assistant for the books at least, but she will not hear of it." He paused. "She has been a little quiet this year, since the spring. I do not know quite why. Mother is not given to being told things. You understand." "I do understand. Well," he smiled with effort, "I shall not keep you in the cold. Good night, Miss Marple." "Good night, Mr. Quinton." He went round to the front of the tier-room and let himself in with a key, calling softly, "Mother, it is only me." Miss Marple saw, through the window, Sylvia Quinton lift her head. She did not start. She did not turn quickly. She lifted her head with the same small, unhurried movement with which she poured tea, and her face composed into a mother's welcome before her son was through the door. Miss Marple walked on. At Edith's gate she paused and looked back down the lane. The tier-room lamp had been turned up. Two figures moved in the lit window. Daniel taking off his coat, Sylvia putting the kettle on. From this distance it was a domestic scene of perfect ordinariness. A woman, her grown son, a late supper. Miss Marple stood with her hand on the gate for some moments. She was thinking, though she would not have said so to anyone, even to Edith, who would have asked her what she meant, of the precise quality of stillness with which Sylvia Quinton had been sitting before her son arrived. It was not loneliness. Lonely women fidgeted, or read, or knitted, or talked to a cat. It was not grief of the recent kind. Recent grief was restless. It was the stillness of a woman who had decided at something some while ago, and was now living inside the decision, the way one lived inside a room. Miss Marple did not yet know what the decision was. She went in to Edith, who was dozing by the fire, and woke her gently and reported on the meeting. The lich-gate, the bus, the chrysanthemums. "And how did you find the Major?" Edith asked, with her bright, shrewd look. "Convivial," said Miss Marple, and a little frightened of Mrs. Drake. "Ah," said Edith. "Yes, that has been the case for 30 years, my dear, and shows no sign of changing. That, however, is the matter of the next part of our story. Saturday, and the harvest tea was now 4 days away. Saturday came in cold and bright, with a wind off the downs that took the last of the rowan leaves off the tree by the lich-gate, and scattered them down the lane like small red coins. By 11 o'clock the village was already moving toward the tier-room. Women in their good coats, 2 or 3 children running ahead, Major Henshaw stumping down the high street with a bottle of something tucked under his arm as a contribution. The harvest tea was not a grand event. It was a village event, which is to say that everyone came, and everyone knew which seat the Major would take, and everyone had a small private opinion about Sylvia Quinton's catering that they would not on the day voice aloud. Miss Marple arrived at 11:30 on the curate's arm. Edith had decided in the morning that her hip would not bear the walk, and had pressed Miss Marple to go on alone. The curate, calling at the cottage to ask after Edith, had offered to escort her instead. They walked down Church Lane together in the wind, the curate keeping up a gentle commentary on which family had baked which contribution, and Miss Marple noting, as she always noted on such walks, the small, ordinary pleasures of being briefly inside another village's life. The tea-room had been transformed. The small round tables had been pushed against the walls and laid with white cloths and harvest decorations. Sheaves of wheat, gourds, late dahlias in jars. Mrs. Drake's chrysanthemums had, after all, prevailed in 2 tall arrangements either side of the counter, and Miss Marple privately conceded that Mrs. Drake had been wrong about them overpowering the room. A long trestle had been set across the back where the cakes and scones were laid out. Annie Loft and another girl from the village were behind the trestle in fresh aprons, and Sylvia Quinton stood at the head of the table, pouring from the great brown pot. The scones were on 3 large platters, the plain, the fruit, and on a smaller platter, slightly apart, the special, chestnut and praline, in a darker, denser scone with a glaze of something amber across the top. A small card propped against the platter read, in Sylvia's neat hand, "Chestnut and praline scone. Contains almonds." Miss Marple read the card and moved past it. She took a plain scone with butter and a cup of tea, and found a seat near the window where she could watch the room. The village arranged itself. Major Henshaw established himself in the corner with 2 of his cronies. Beatrice Drake sat near the trestle with her gloves still on, supervising. Dr. Hargreaves came in at 20 to 12, slightly flushed, and was given tea by Annie. Mrs. Paget and her sister took a small table by the fire. Daniel Quinton, down again for the weekend, was helping his mother behind the counter, fetching milk, carrying the empty pots back to the kitchen, with the willing air of a son trying to be useful. Helena Marsden came in at 12:05. She wore a dark green dress and a small string of garnets, and she had clearly taken trouble. She greeted the curate at the door, smiled at Mrs. Paget, and made her way to the trestle. The room did not stop. A village too well bred for that. But the small ambient hum of conversation tightened by a half-degree, the way a string tightens under the tuning peg. "Mrs. Quinton, Miss Marsden, you came. I would not have missed it." Sylvia poured Helena's tea, black with the slice of lemon ready on the saucer. Helena thanked her and turned to the scones. "And the special?" she said lightly. "The chestnut. May I?" "Of course." "With cream? Please." Sylvia lifted a scone onto a plate with the small silver tongs, split it, spread it with butter and then a curl of clotted cream from the bowl, and handed the plate to Helena. "The card on the platter contains almonds. Was clearly visible to both women. "How beautifully you do it," Helena said. "It is only a scone, Miss Marsden." Helena carried her plate to a small table near the window, 3 tables away from Miss Marple, and sat down. She took a sip of tea. She lifted the scone. She took a bite. Miss Marple, watching without appearing to watch, saw Helena's small frown of pleasure at the first taste, and then, perhaps 15 seconds later, a different small frown, a checking inward expression, the look of a woman attending to a sensation she could not yet name. Helena set the scone down. She took another sip of tea. She lifted her hand and touched her throat. A moment passed in which the room did not yet know anything was wrong. Helena Marsden, who had lived for 50 years with a particular knowledge of her own body, stood up from her chair very calmly. She said, in a voice that was clear but slightly thicker than her ordinary voice, "I think I need my bag. Annie, dear, my bag is on the peg in the hall." Annie, by the trestle, did not at once move. She had not heard properly over the noise of the urn. Helena said, more loudly, "My bag! In the hall! The brown bag!" It was the second saying of it that turned the room. Mrs. Paget looked up. The curate looked up. Major Henshaw, in the corner, half rose. Dr. Hargreaves set down his cup and stood. Annie ran for the hall. By the time Annie was back with the brown handbag, Helena was sitting again, but not as she had been sitting. She was leaning a little forward, with one hand on the edge of the table, and her breathing had taken on a small audible rasp that had not been there a minute before. Her face was beginning to flush in patches, and the skin around her mouth was tightening in a way that Miss Marple, who had nursed her mother through pneumonia long ago, recognized at once as the body fighting for air it was not getting. "The syringe," Helena said. "Inside. The case." Annie opened the bag with shaking hands. The small leather case was there. She passed it to Dr. Hargreaves, who had crossed the room and was now at Helena's elbow. The doctor opened the case. The syringe was inside, prepared with its small glass ampoule. Dr. Hargreaves's hands were not steady. Miss Marple, watching from her table, saw the small extra tremor of a man who had taken something stronger than tea at his 11 o'clock, and was now being asked, in front of 40 witnesses, to perform a precise medical act on a woman in respiratory crisis. He fumbled the cap. He recovered it. He drew up the dose. He lifted Helena's arm. She was no longer speaking now, only making the small dry sounds of a person whose throat was closing, and pressed the needle. The needle went in. The plunger went down. But the angle had been wrong, or the dose lost, or the timing already past the moment when adrenaline could have answered. Miss Marple saw the doctor's face change. He pressed again, fumbled the second ampoule out of the case, tried again. By now, Helena had slumped sideways against the table. Her breathing had become very shallow. The curate was on his knees beside her, holding her hand. Major Henshaw was bellowing for someone to telephone Salisbury for an ambulance. Mrs. Paget was crying. Helena Marsden died at 12:18 in a chair by the window of the old mill-tea room, with a half-eaten scone on the plate in front of her and her brown handbag open on the floor. The room did not move for some moments after. Then, as if a single held breath had been released, several things happened at once. the curate beginning to pray, the doctor sitting back on his heels and putting his face briefly in his hands, the major covering Mrs. Paget's sister with a chair-back rug because she had begun to shake, Annie weeping into her apron. Miss Marple, who had risen from her own table, did not approach Helena. She turned instead very slightly and looked toward the kitchen doorway. Sylvia Quinton stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands folded in front of her apron. She was perfectly still. She was looking not at Helena and not at the doctor, but at the small platter on the trestle with the chestnut and praline scones on it. And her face was composed in exactly the same composure with which she had poured tea on Tuesday and on Sunday, and on the afternoon of Miss Marple's arrival. She stood that way for perhaps 4 seconds. Then she stepped forward and crossed to her son, and put her hand very gently on Daniel's shoulder, and said, "Daniel, telephone Constable Pike, please." Daniel went. Miss Marple, in the same moment, registered 3 things. The doctor's tremor, the small card still propped against the platter, and the precise quality of Sylvia Quinton's stillness in the doorway. She did not yet put them together. That, however, is the matter of the next part of our story. Helena Marsden was carried from the tier room at 1:20 on Saturday afternoon, on a stretcher, under a blanket the curate had fetched from his own house. The ambulance from Salisbury arrived too late to do anything but make the journey official. Constable Pike, who had been at his sister's in the next village when Daniel telephoned, came on his bicycle and took down particulars in his small black book with the laborious courtesy of a man unused to deaths that were not from old age. By 4 o'clock the tier room had been closed, Mrs. Drake had been escorted home by the curate, Major Henshaw had retreated to the Grange, and Sylvia Quinton, composed, pale, attentive, had given her own statement to the constable at the kitchen table. It had been an allergic reaction. Everyone agreed. Miss Marsden had taken a scone known to contain almonds. Miss Marsden had been allergic, as the village had known for 30 years, not to almonds, but to peanuts. The almond and the peanut were, to most of the village, not the same thing at all, but Dr. Hargreaves, speaking carefully, with his hand a little steadier than it had been at 12, observed that severe nut allergies could sometimes cross-react, that traces of one nut in a kitchen that handled another were not unheard of, and that Helena's syringe, which he had inspected, was perhaps 4 months past the date stamped on the ampoule. She should have replaced it, he said. I told her so in April. I told her so again in June. It was the kind of explanation a village accepts. By Saturday evening the village had accepted it. Mrs. Paget at the post office had told 3 people independently that it was the syringe. You know, old stock, and the doctor said so. The doctor's 11 o'clock brandy was not mentioned in any of these accounts. Miss Marple slept badly that Saturday night. She did not at once know why. On Sunday morning Edith was in low spirits. She had known Helena slightly, had liked her without ever quite warming to her, and now felt the small particular guilt of a person whose acquaintance had ended on a polite distance rather than a kindness. Miss Marple sat with her through breakfast and after, then walked alone to the 11 o'clock service. The Reverend Combe spoke briefly and well. He did not pretend to know Helena Marsden, but he spoke of welcoming returns, of the village's responsibility to those who came back to it after long absence, and of the particular gentleness owed to anyone whose place in the community was not yet fully made. Miss Marple, listening, thought him a finer young man than his anxious shoulders suggested. After the service, he caught her at the latch-gate. "Miss Marple, might I walk you back? I should like the air, and I confess I should like the company. I should be very glad." They turned not toward Edith's, but down past the green, by the curate's suggestion. "A longer way, but I find I cannot quite face the High Street this morning." Miss Marple understood. The High Street ran past the tea-room, and the tea-room was, for the present, a closed door with the closed sign turned out and the curtains drawn. They walked instead along the lane that ran behind the church, past the orchard and the back of the schoolhouse to where the war memorial stood at the meeting of three paths. The memorial was a plain stone obelisk on a square base, with the names of the village dead cut into its four faces. The 1914 to 1918 list considerably longer than the 1939 to 1945 list, which was the proportion in most English villages. The curate paused. "Forgive me, I always stop here. It is a small private habit. A good one." He stood with his hat in his hand, reading the names in silence. Miss Marple, who was a step behind him, let her eyes travel down the 1939 to 1945 face, more from politeness than purpose. There were 11 names on it. She read them as one reads a list, half attending, until her eye caught, near the middle, Quinton, A.J., 1937. She read it twice. "Mr. Combe," she said, with the small, careful note of a woman who does not wish to make more of a thing than it is, "may I ask?" "Quinton, A.J. This is the Mrs. Quinton of the tea-room's husband?" The curate looked. "Oh, yes, Arthur Quinton. I asked Mrs. Drake about it when I first came. He died in 1937, not in the war at all. He was a postman, I believe, and had a heart. He is on the wrong plaque, you see. He should not be on it at all, but it was put there in the late 40s when the second list was cut, and Mrs. Quinton asked the council if his name might go on it. She said he would have served if he had lived. The council, I gather there was some debate, but the Major was for it, and they did it. Sentiment, really, the village agreed. How interesting. You think it odd? I think it a particular kind of love, Mr. Combe. I have not often seen it." She did not say more. They walked on. The curate, who had been waiting, said after a little while, "Miss Marple, may I trouble you with something? It is a small thing, perhaps a foolish thing, but it has been on my mind since yesterday. Please." When Miss Marsden, when she first realized she was unwell, she asked for her bag, and then she said, "I was 3 feet from her. I heard it quite distinctly." She said, "Annie, dear, my bag is on the peg in the hall." Not the peg, the peg. As though there were only one peg, and she knew which. I had not thought, at the time, how she could have known. She had been in the tea-room perhaps a dozen times since April. I myself, who go in every week, could not tell you with certainty which peg I last hung my coat upon. Miss Marple was quiet a moment. "It is a small thing, Mr. Combe." "Yes, but you are right to have noticed it. Most people would not. Does it mean anything? I do not know yet. It may mean only that Miss Marsden was a tidy woman who always used the same peg. Tidy women do. Or it may mean she had been told, at some point, where her bag had been put. Perhaps by someone who had taken it for her on arrival and had hung it themselves. The curate considered this. Mrs. Quinton took her coat at the door. I remember. She did it for several of the ladies. She has a way of doing it without making a fuss. Yes, Miss Marple said. She would. They walked on in silence. At the cottage gate, the curate raised his hat to her, and she thanked him for the walk, and he said, with the smallest hesitation of a young man trying to be tactful, Miss Marple, you will not, that is, you do not think there is anything in any of it, do you? In Miss Marsden's death, I mean. The village seems quite settled. The village is settled, Mr. Coombe. I am not yet sure that I am. But I have no reason for my unsettlement, which is to say, I have nothing I could give to a constable. Pay it no mind for the present. I shall pay it no mind, then. But if you should wish to speak to anyone, I am at the curate's house most afternoons. You are very kind. She watched him walk back down the lane, his hat in his hand against the wind, and she stood at the gate for some moments after he had gone from sight. She was thinking of the war memorial, and of the wrong name on the wrong plaque, and of a postman who had died in 1937 of a heart condition, and of a wife who had loved him enough to put him among the war, dead, though he had not died in a war. A particular kind of love, she had said. She had not been quite right. It was a particular kind of something, and love was the name the village had given it, and the village had been content with the name. Miss Marple was not at this moment content. She went in to Edith. Edith was at the parlour window. Jane, there is news. The constable has been to the doctor, and the doctor has, well, apparently the certificate has not been signed, or has been signed and queried. I am not clear. But Mrs. Paget has just been past, on her way back from the post, and she says an inspector is coming from Salisbury on Monday morning. An inspector. Slack, I think she said. A Mr. Slack. Miss Marple sat down opposite Edith at the parlour window. She did not at once reply. That, however, is the matter of the next part of our story. Inspector Slack arrived from Salisbury at 9:20 on Monday morning, in a black car, driven by a sergeant, whose name Miss Marple did not at first catch. He set up in the parish hall, displacing the Tuesday whist club from their cupboard, and by 10:30 he had sent for Major Henshaw. By 11 he had sent for Dr. Hargreaves. By 12 he had sent for Sylvia Quinton. By 1 he had sent for Annie Loft, who came in tears, and was sent home again after 15 minutes with a glass of water. Miss Marple knew Inspector Slack of old. He was not a fool. He was, she had long since concluded, the particular sort of policeman who was clever enough to be quick and not quite clever enough to be patient. A combination that produced, in 9 cases out of 10, an excellent rate of arrest, and in the 10th case a catastrophe. He had a small, dark moustache, a habit of speaking through it, and the firm conviction which Miss Marple had never been able to dislodge, that elderly ladies were chiefly to be managed by being thanked briskly for their interest, and shown to the door. She did not present herself at the parish hall. There would have been no point. She sat instead in Edith's parlour with her knitting, and she let the village come to her, which it did, in the ordinary way, through Mrs. Bunting from the kitchen, and through Mrs. Paget's daughter, who stopped at the gate with a parcel for Edith, and through the curate, who called at 3 with a small jar of his housekeeper's marmalade, and the news that the Major had been at the parish hall for nearly 2 hours. 2 hours, said Miss Marple. That is a great deal of conversation. Mrs. Drake says he came out very red in the face. She saw him from her front window. She said he went straight to the Grange and shut the door. And the doctor? An hour. Less. He came out grey, the constable said. And Mrs. Quinton? 40 minutes. She came out as she went in. She has reopened the tier room this afternoon with a black ribbon on the door. I thought it dignified. It is dignified, said Miss Marple. Mrs. Quinton does most things with dignity. The curate hesitated. Miss Marple, I should not say this, perhaps, but Mrs. Paget at the post office is telling everyone who comes in that it is the Major, that he had an old understanding with Miss Marsden, that he wrote her a letter when she came back, that he was seen at the side of the tier room on Saturday where he had no business to be. She is, well, she is enjoying herself. Forgive me. It is not for you to apologize for Mrs. Paget, Mr. Coombe. No, only the village seems to have decided, all at once, that it was the Major. I had not expected that. I had expected we should all say it was an accident. The arrival of Inspector Slack changes such things. People who would not have thought of murder on Sunday will be thinking of nothing else by Wednesday. It is the natural action of a uniform in a village. You sound as though you have seen it before. I have seen it before. He left at 20 to 4. Miss Marple sat on with her knitting for some while after, and at 4:30 she put on her coat and went out. She did not go toward the parish hall. She went up the lane past the church, and along the back path that the curate had shown her on Sunday, and she came round to the parish hall from behind. There was a low wall there, and a bench under a yew, and from the bench one could see the side door of the hall, through which witnesses came and went. She sat on the bench with her knitting in her lap and the wind in the yew above her, and she waited. Major Henshaw was not at the hall at present. He had been summoned again for 5 o'clock. Mrs. Bunting, who knew the constable's wife, had reported this at lunch. Miss Marple had not been waiting more than 12 minutes when the Major came up the path from the High Street, very red about the cheeks, with the small set shoulders of a man who had been told something he did not like, and had decided to deny it harder. He did not see Miss Marple. He went in. She heard, through the side window, which had been left a little ajar, the first exchange clearly. "Major Henshaw! Sit down, please. I have sat down twice today, Inspector. I shall stand if I prefer." "As you wish. I am asking you again about the letter." "There was no letter." "Mrs. Paget at the post office states that a letter in Miss Marsden's hand was franked to you on the 12th of April. Mrs. Paget is mistaken. Mrs. Paget has been postmistress at Marsham Bredy for 19 years. Then she has had 19 years to learn to mind her own business. A small silence. Miss Marple, on the bench, knitted on. Major Henshaw. On Saturday at 12 minutes past 12, you were seen by 2 witnesses leaving the side passage of the old mill tea room. Will you tell me what you were doing in the side passage? A long pause. I will not. You decline to answer? I decline to answer a question that has no bearing on this matter, and that touches on my private, on a matter of personal dignity. Major, I must put it to you that your decline to answer will be unfavourable to you. Then let it be unfavourable. I am a gentleman, Inspector. Miss Marple heard Inspector Slack's small intake of breath. She knew the sound. It was the sound of a policeman who has decided, in a single half-second, that the man in front of him is lying about something, and that the something is large enough to act upon. Major Henshaw, on Saturday morning you wrote a document on Grange notepaper. You have not posted it. You have not destroyed it. It is at present in the second drawer of your desk. I should be obliged if you would give me permission to see it. I shall have a warrant by tomorrow morning if you do not. A longer silence. You will have a warrant. Very well, and I shall instruct my solicitor. That is your right, Major. The Major came out of the hall 4 minutes later. He passed within 20 feet of the yew and did not see Miss Marple. He went down the path toward the High Street with his shoulders set and his face the colour of cold beef. Miss Marple folded her knitting. She rose. She went back the way she had come, past the church, past the Lich Gate, into Church Lane. By the time she reached the War Memorial, the first rain of the evening had begun. Fine, cold, and steady, the kind of rain that did not announce itself, but soaked one's coat in 15 minutes. She stood at the memorial in the rain and looked again at the wrong name on the wrong plaque. Quinton, A.J., 1937, she thought. He wrote a letter on Saturday morning to a woman he had not seen in 30 years and who would be dead by 1218, and he has not destroyed it. He is a fool, and he is hiding something, and he did not kill her. He had not the temperament. A man who killed her would have burned the letter. A man who was guilty of cowardice only would keep it in a drawer. She thought, Inspector Slack will arrest him by Thursday. She thought, last, the wrong man. She walked on through the rain to Edith's. By the time she reached the gate, her hat was dark with wet and her hands inside her gloves were cold. Edith was at the window with the lamp turned up and the kettle was on, and Mrs. Bunting had laid out a small tea for 2. Jane, you are wet through. What have you been about? Listening, Edith. To what? To a policeman making the mistake he was always going to make. Edith looked at her. You do not mean, I mean nothing yet. I mean only that I am very tired and that I should like my tea. That, however, is the matter of the next part of our story. Tuesday came in grey. The rain had not stopped in the night. It had only changed quality from the fine soaking rain of evening to a thinner, more persistent drizzle that misted the windows of Edith's parlour and turned the village green to the colour of wet slate. Miss Marple woke early, dressed deliberately, and came down to find Mrs. Bunting already at the range with the porridge on. She ate her breakfast slowly, She read a chapter of the novel Edith had pressed on her the night before. At 10 o'clock she sat down at the small writing table in the parlour window and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Miss Henrietta Sayers in Hampstead, who had been a friend of Miss Marple's late cousin Ethel, and who had spent 11 years in Cape Town as the wife of a colonial chaplain. The letter was brief and quite specific. Miss Marple did not write, "I am asking on behalf of an investigation," she wrote. Instead, that she had taken an interest in a particular former parishioner of Marsham Bredy, a Miss Helena Marsden, who had gone out to Cape Town in late 1934 or early 1935, and that she would be grateful for any recollection or contact who might recall the lady's circumstances in those years. Particularly, she wrote, with the small underlined precision that Henrietta would understand. Any quiet arrangement that a young woman of that period might have wished to make. She sealed the letter and addressed it. The second was to Beatrice Drake. It was even briefer. Miss Marple wrote that she would be most grateful if Mrs. Drake could spare her half an hour that afternoon. 3 o'clock, perhaps, if convenient, to discuss a matter of some delicacy. She did not say what the matter was. She walked to the post office herself. Mrs. Paget, behind the counter, looked up with the bright, watchful interest of a woman who had spent 2 days at the centre of village news and was not yet tired of it. 2 letters, Miss Marple, both first class. Local for one. Oh, only the Drake one is local. I shall put it in the hand delivery box, shall I? Tom takes the village ones at noon. That would be most kind. Mrs. Paget did not at once weigh the second letter. She held it a moment too long. Hampstead, Miss Marple? You have friends in Hampstead? A great many people have friends in Hampstead, Mrs. Paget. It is a populous neighbourhood. Oh, yes. Of course. Miss Marple paid for her stamps and turned to go. At the door she paused, as though a thought had just occurred to her, and said, Mrs. Paget, that letter you mentioned. The one Miss Marsden franked to the Major in April. You are quite sure it went? As sure as I am of my own hand, Miss Marple. I franked it myself. Tuesday the 12th. A small cream envelope. Miss Marsden's own paper. She ordered it from a stationer in Salisbury. The Major's name on it as clear as print. And after, did he ever come in the days following, with anything for her in return? Mrs. Paget considered. No, he did not. He never replied. Which is why, well, one did wonder. Yes, one would. Thank you, Mrs. Paget. She walked down the High Street and turned, on impulse, into the lane that led past the back gardens of the houses along Church Walk. The Major's house, the Grange, stood at the end. She did not go to the gate. She paused at the field path that ran behind the property, where the air carried, even in the wet morning, the small unmistakable smell she had noted twice now. Wax and paper, very faintly burned. She stood a moment. From the field path one could see, over the low garden wall, the small brick incinerator the Major used for garden waste. It was wet now, blackened, but a thin grey smear of recent ash had run down its side in the rain. She walked on. She thought as she walked. He burned a letter on Saturday morning. He has not burned what is in his desk drawer. The letter he burned was hers. Her note from April, which he had kept long enough to be afraid of and not long enough to be brave about. The letter he kept was his, which he could not bring himself to destroy, because, in the writing of it, he had said at last the true thing he had not said for 30 years. He will lose his standing in the village over this. He will not lose his life. He did not kill her. She reached Beatrice Drake's house at 3:04. The Drake house was the second largest in Marsham Bredy. A square Georgian box behind a hedge of yew, with 2 iron urns at the door that had been planted, by long Drake tradition, with red geraniums in summer and with nothing at all in winter. Mrs. Drake's maid showed Miss Marple into the drawing-room and announced her in the small formal voice of a household where such things were still done properly. Beatrice Drake rose from the fire. She was in dark blue wool, her gloves on. She did not smile, but she inclined her head with the particular politeness she reserved for visitors she had not quite decided about. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Drake, it is very kind of you. Please sit. Tea?" "Thank you." They sat. The maid brought the tea. They spoke of the reign, of the parish council, of Mrs. Pelham's hip for some 12 minutes. Miss Marple, who had not come for any of these things, let the conversation find its own moment. It came when Mrs. Drake set down her cup and said, "You did not write to me to discuss my chrysanthemums, Miss Marple." "No." "Then please." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. She spoke quietly, without preamble. "Mrs. Drake, I believe that Helena Marsden left Marsham Bredy in November 1934 because she was carrying a child. I believe she told one person in the village, and that person was you. I believe you advised her to go. I believe you have carried the secret for 30 years and have never spoken it to anyone. Not to your late husband, not to your son, not to the Major, who would have had the most natural claim upon it. I believe that when she came back in April, you were not cold to her out of old anger, as the village supposes. I believe you were cold to her because the secret had walked back into the village in her person, and you did not know whether she meant to speak it, and you could not bring yourself to ask. I am sorry to put it to you so plainly. I should not put it to you at all if Miss Marsden were still living." Mrs. Drake did not move. She did not look at Miss Marple. She looked at the fire. A long silence ran out into the room. Then Mrs. Drake said, in a voice that was steady but very low, "I have wondered since Saturday whether it would go to the constable. I have not been able to decide what I should tell him. I had thought I should go to Mr. Coombe. I had not thought that you should come to me." "I did not come for the constable, Mrs. Drake." "No, I see that you did not." She paused. "It was the Major's child. It was not." A sharper silence. Mrs. Drake's eyes came at last to Miss Marple's face. "You know whose. I have a strong supposition." "Then keep your supposition to yourself for the present, Miss Marple. I will tell you what I know if you will give me until tomorrow morning. There is more to it than the child. There was always more to it than the child. I had thought, when she came back, that she had come back to say it. I had thought on Saturday that she had been about to. Mrs. Drake? Was it Arthur Quinton?" Beatrice Drake closed her eyes. "Tomorrow morning, Miss Marple. I will tell you tomorrow morning. I have lived inside this for 30 years. You may give me a night. I shall give you a night, Miss Marple rose. Mrs. Drake rose with her. At the door of the drawing-room, Beatrice Drake said, without turning, "Miss Marple, there is something else." The London solicitor. He was here twice. She told me, on the second occasion, that she was changing her will. She said there was someone she wished to provide for whom she had not provided for before, and someone else she wished to leave something to who had no idea such a thing was coming. I did not ask. I should have asked. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I think you should have." She walked back to Edith's in the rain. That, however, is the matter of the next part of our story. Wednesday morning brought 2 letters. The first was from Henrietta Sayers in Hampstead, posted by return. Henrietta had always been a woman who answered letters the day she received them, and Miss Marple had counted on it. The second was a small folded note from Mrs. Drake, brought up by the Drake maid at 9:30. "Miss Marple, 3 o'clock again, if you will. B.D." Miss Marple opened Henrietta's letter at the parlour window, with Edith asleep in the chair opposite and the rain still falling in the lane. Henrietta had remembered Helena Marsden. She had not known her well. They had met only twice at small chaplaincy gatherings in 1935. But she had remembered her, and more importantly, she had remembered the woman who had taken Helena in on her arrival, a Mrs. Eleanor Crosby, who had run a small private house in the suburb of Rondebosch for young English women in quiet circumstance. Henrietta did not use the phrase unmarried mother. She did not need to. Mrs. Crosby had died in 1953, but her daughter, Catherine, had continued the household for several years, and had, Henrietta believed, kept the books, which, in Mrs. Crosby's establishment, had meant not the accounts, but the records of placements. Henrietta gave an address. "I cannot say," she wrote, "whether Catherine will reply to a letter from a stranger, but I think she might to one from me. I have written to her by the same post." Miss Marple folded the letter and put it inside her Bible for safe-keeping, and she sat for some moments with her hand on the cover, looking at the grey rain. A child given up to a placement in Rondebosch in 1935. A woman who had lived since with the small daily knowledge of her own absence in a daughter's life. A return in 1964 to a village that had not known. A London solicitor twice. A will being changed, she thought. Helena Marsden came home to die in the village of her birth, and to put right by money, if nothing else, the wrong she had done a child 50 years ago. She told the solicitor. She did not tell the village. She had begun to tell Beatrice Drake, perhaps, in the careful way of women who are testing the temperature of a confidence. She had not yet told the one person in the village who most needed to be told, because she had not yet decided whether telling would be a gift or a cruelty. And while she was deciding, someone in the village decided otherwise. She did not yet know who, but the shape of the Y was beginning, very faintly, to lift itself out of the fog of the case, the way the outline of a far hill lifts itself out of the morning mist before the hill itself is visible. At 3 o'clock she was back in Mrs. Drake's drawing-room. Beatrice Drake had not slept. Miss Marple saw it at once. The skin under her eyes was the colour of a bruise, and her gloves were on, and her hands inside them were trembling so slightly that only a woman who had watched for it would have seen. "Sit, please, Miss Marple. I have decided to tell you. I should like to do it without interruption, if you can bear it. I have not said any of this aloud in 30 years. I shall not interrupt." Mrs. Drake sat. She looked at the fire and not at Miss Marple, and she began. "Helena Marsden was my dearest friend, from the time we were 11. I had not, I think, a single thought between the ages of 11 and 23 that I did not at some point share with her. She was cleverer than I was. She was much braver. She made me braver. When she was 26 and I was 28, she came to me one evening in the autumn of 1934 and said she was in trouble. She did not say it as the village would have used the phrase. She said it cleanly. She was carrying a child. The child was not the Major's. The child was Arthur Quinton's, and she had not told and would not tell Arthur, because Arthur had a fiancé in Bristol, by then, to whom he had committed himself the previous spring, and Helena had decided some weeks earlier that she would not stand between him and that life. Mrs. Drake paused. She did not look up. I told her she must go. I told her to go to her cousin in Cape Town and to write to no one until she was settled. I told her that Marsham Bredy would never be a place for her if she stayed. I told her, and this is the thing, Miss Marple, that I have carried. I told her she must never write to Arthur. Never on any pretext. Because Arthur was not the man to bear such a knowledge, and would only break under it and break his wife with him. I said it with great conviction. I was 28, and I knew everything, as one does at 28. She did as I said. She went. She married, after some years, a man in Nairobi whose name I never asked. The child she did not keep. She wrote to me twice in 30 years. I answered neither letter. I had decided that to answer would be to keep the wound open, and I had decided this was a kindness. I see now it was not. A long silence. "Mrs. Drake," said Miss Marple gently, "did Arthur Quinton know?" "He did not in the year that mattered. He married Sylvia in 1936. He was a postman, Miss Marple. He was a sweet, weak, easily fond man, and I did not trust him with the truth, and I was, I think, correct not to trust him with it. He died in 1937. He died not knowing. And after he died? After he died, there was no one to tell. Helena did not come back. The fiancée had become the widow. The widow ran a tear room. The tear room was a tear room, and the years passed. Miss Marple was quiet. She said, after a moment, "Mrs. Drake. Helena came back in April. She has been in Marsham Bredy 6 months. Did you, in those 6 months, ever come to think that someone else in this village had learned what you and I have just discussed?" Mrs. Drake looked at her at last. "I have thought about little else since Saturday afternoon, Miss Marple. I have lain awake with it. I cannot see how. Helena did not tell. I did not tell. Arthur did not know. There is no one else who could have known. There is one person who could have come to know it after the fact." "Who?" "A wife who, 23 years after her husband's death, found his old correspondence in an attic." Mrs. Drake did not at once speak. The fire shifted. A coal fell. "Sylvia," she said. "Yes, Sylvia Quinton. Yes. Oh, dear God!" She put her gloved hand over her mouth. Miss Marple did not speak. Mrs. Drake sat very still for perhaps 2 minutes, and then she lowered her hand and said, in a voice that was almost steady, "You are sure?" "I am not sure. I am very nearly sure. I shall not be sure until I have looked at one thing, and asked one question, and heard the answer in her own voice." "What thing?" "A jar of praline on a shelf, Mrs. Drake. That is all. A jar of praline that ought not still to be there." Mrs. Drake closed her eyes. "She has had her in the tea-room every week, Miss Marple." Helena had taken to going on Tuesdays as well as Sundays. Sylvia poured her tea. Sylvia knew her allergy. Sylvia spoke of the allergy on Sunday at the counter. I heard her. I would not put a peanut anywhere near my kitchen. I heard her say it. Yes, so did I. And she was waiting. She was waiting, Mrs. Drake. She had been waiting, I think, for 8 or 9 months, since she found whatever she found in her attic. She was not a woman who would act in a temper. She was a woman who would wait until the act could be made to look like a misfortune, and until the village would help her by calling it one. Saturday was her opportunity. The harvest tea, the special scone, the card on the platter naming almonds. The doctor she knew would not be steady. The syringe she knew was old, because Helena, who was a tidy woman, had mentioned to her in the tea-room in June that she must remember to replace it, and had not. Mrs. Drake said nothing. Miss Marple rose. "I am going to the tea-room now, Mrs. Drake." "Miss Marple, wait, the Major." "Inspector Slack is going too." "Yes, he is." "I shall reach the tea-room first." That, however, is the matter of the next part of our story. Miss Marple did not go straight to the tea-room from Mrs. Drake's. She went home first, to Edith's, and changed her wet stockings, and ate a small piece of bread and butter Mrs. Bunting pressed upon her, and sat in the parlour for a quarter of an hour, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the fire. Edith, who had learned over 60 years not to ask Miss Marple what she was thinking when she sat that way, did not ask. She read her novel, and occasionally she looked across at her friend, and once she said, "Jane, you are very pale," and Miss Marple said, "I am quite well, Edith, thank you." And that was the whole of their conversation between 3 and 4. At 4 o'clock Miss Marple rose, put on her coat, a different coat, drier, and her good hat, and walked down the lane to the tea-room. The closed sign with the black ribbon was no longer on the door. The ribbon was on the door, but the sign had been turned to open. Through the lit window, Miss Marple could see 2 figures at the tables. Mrs. Paget at one, with a pot of tea and a slice of cake, and the curate at another, marking what looked like a service sheet. Sylvia Quinton was behind the counter, polishing a tea-glass with a cloth. Miss Marple opened the door. The bell gave its small domestic note. "Miss Marple! Come in, Mrs. Quinton. You will have tea. A pot, china, please, as before, and if there is one, a plain scone. With butter only." "Of course." She crossed to the small table by the window, where she had sat on her first afternoon. The curate looked up, smiled, half rose. She gave him the small gesture that meant, "Please do not disturb yourself." And he resumed his marking. Mrs. Paget, at her table, was eating her cake with the particular slow attentiveness of a woman who had nothing else to be at, and would not be hurried home. Sylvia brought the pot. She set it down. She set down the small jug of milk and the cup and the saucer and the plate with the plain scone and the curl of butter, and she said, with the small attentive air she gave to all her customers, "Will you take cream as well, Miss Marple?" "Only butter, thank you." "Very well." She turned back to the counter. She did not linger. She was, Miss Marple observed, exactly as she had been on Sunday. Neat, calm, sleeves turned back 2 folds at the wrist, hair pinned without fuss. The black ribbon on the door was the only outward sign that anything in the tea-room had changed since Saturday morning. Miss Marple ate her scone slowly. She drank her tea. She let her eyes travel the room without travelling it. The small habit of a lifetime of looking at a place by looking at the things she was not ostensibly looking at. The row of jars on the shelf behind the counter was the same row of jars. Quince, blackberry, damson, marrow ginger. And at the end, the small jar that on her first visit had been at the end of the row and had been new and full. The praline, the jar was still there. The lid was on. The contents. Miss Marple was sitting 15 feet from the shelf, and her sight was not what it had been at 50, but she had positioned herself with that shelf in her line of vision, and she had taken her time about it. The contents stood at a little below the halfway mark of the jar. Perhaps 4 ounces remained inside, perhaps slightly less, half empty. For a scone served once a year on one Saturday 3 days previously. She finished her tea. She caught Sylvia's eye and raised a hand to signal that she would settle, and Sylvia came across with the small slip on a saucer. Miss Marple did not at once produce her purse. She said very pleasantly, "Mrs. Quinton, the special scone on Saturday was a great success, I thought. People spoke of it warmly all through. I wondered, is it kept on the menu at all after the harvest tea for a week or 2? My friend Mrs. Pelham was sorry to have missed it." Sylvia smiled. It was a small, kind smile, the smile of a tea-room proprietress who has been complimented on a recipe. "It is only a yearly thing, you know, Miss Marple. The special. I make a different one each year for the harvest tea, and once that day is done I do not make it again until the following autumn. It would not be special otherwise." "Of course. That is sensible. Mrs. Pelham, if she should care for one, may have a plain or a fruit at any time, with my compliments, sent up to the cottage. I should be very glad." "How very kind. I shall tell her." "Was there anything else, Miss Marple?" "Nothing else, thank you." She paid. She rose. She thanked Sylvia again for the scone. She crossed to the door and went out, and the bell gave its small domestic note behind her as the door closed. She walked 4 paces up the lane and stopped. She did not walk on at once. She stood where she was, on the wet pavement outside the old mill tea-room, with the wind coming down off the downs, and her coat already beginning to darken with the first drops of fresh rain, and she let the thing settle. A scone made once a year. A jar of praline opened, by Sylvia's account, for that one Saturday, and that one Saturday only. The jar still on the shelf, half empty. Half empty. A village woman who baked precisely. A village woman whose tea-room was arranged with the small obsessive care of a person who knew where every jar belonged, and which side of the table each customer preferred. A village woman who would not, in the ordinary way of her own work, have left out on her shelf an open jar of an ingredient that she would not use again until next September, unless the jar on the shelf was not the jar she had baked from, unless the jar on the shelf was the visible jar. Almond praline, labelled in her own neat hand, half emptied to look used. And the jar she had baked from was a different jar, bought elsewhere, of a different praline, and now disposed of. Miss Marple, standing in the lane, thought, "The jar on the shelf is a stage prop." It was always a stage prop. She emptied half of it out at some point. Into the bin, into the river, it does not matter. So that the shelf, when a constable or an inspector eventually came to the tier room and looked, would show a half-used jar of almond praline. She did it perhaps on Friday evening, perhaps on Saturday morning. She has done it because she is a careful woman. She has done it because she has been careful about every part of this for 8 months. And then, in the busy morning of the harvest tea, she forgot to take the jar off the shelf afterwards. She forgot to wash the jar out. She forgot, because no one had yet thought of the death as anything other than an accident, that the jar was still standing there as evidence of what she wished to be believed. And by Monday, when Inspector Slack arrived and the village began to think of murder, she could not remove the jar without drawing attention to its removal. So she left it. The jar on the shelf is the thing she did not finish. She thought, "Last, I have her." The rain was coming on harder. She turned and walked up the lane, past the War Memorial, past the Lich Gate, toward Edith's cottage. She did not hurry. She walked at the ordinary pace of an elderly lady going home to her tea on a wet Wednesday evening in late September. She would write that night to Catherine Crosby in Rondebosch. She would write to the London solicitor. She would speak to Annie Loft. In the morning, alone away from the tier room, she would clear the Major. And then she would go back to the Old Mill tier room and sit at a table and order a pot of tea and ask Sylvia Quinton, very quietly, to sit down with her. That, however, is the matter of the next part of our story. Thursday morning was clearer. The rain had blown out in the night, and the village stood washed, and bright under a hard, pale sky, the kind of late September sky that announces, without quite committing to it, the first frost of the year. Miss Marple, who had slept properly for the first time in 5 nights, woke at 6:30, dressed without hurry, and was at the kitchen door of the Old Mill tier room by 8:20. Before the tier room opened, before Sylvia Quinton came down from the rooms above, when Annie Loft would be alone with the bread oven, she knocked. Annie opened the door in her apron, with flour on her wrist. "Miss Marple, is everything? Is Mrs. Pelham?" "Mrs. Pelham is very well, my dear. I have come to ask you a small thing, and I should rather not ask it where Mrs. Quinton might hear." "May I come in for 2 minutes?" Annie hesitated, only a moment. She stood aside. The kitchen was warm and very clean. The bread was rising on the back of the range. Annie did not sit. She stood by the table, twisting her apron, with the wary expression of a country girl of 18, who had been questioned by a police inspector on Monday, and did not wish to be questioned by anybody about anything ever again. Miss Marple did not sit either. She spoke as she would have spoken to one of her own village girls in St. Mary Mead, quietly, with the small assumption of trust that was, more often than not, returned in kind. Annie, on Saturday at the harvest tea, when the tea-room was very full, I happened to overhear you say something to the other girl, the one helping you. You said, "I sent the Major round the back like a tradesman, didn't I?" It was said as a joke. I should very much like to know what you meant by it. It is important. It is not to do with you in any way. Annie's face changed at once, not to fear, but to the small relief of a person being asked, after long suspense, about something quite ordinary. "Oh, that. Yes, miss. It was nothing. The Major came in at, must have been 12, just before the bad business, and he asked very politely if he might use the gentleman's. We've only the one, you see, and it was being used by old Mr. Brisley, who is, well, he is slow, miss, since his stroke." The Major was rather in a hurry. He went red. He said, could he be permitted the side passage, the lavatory, by the kitchen door, the one we use ourselves? I didn't know him properly. I mean, I'd seen him in church, but I'd never served him a tea in my life, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. I thought he was a tradesman come to the wrong door. I said, "Round the back, then, mind the step," the way I'd say it to the milkman. He went round and came back not 3 minutes later, and that was that. Afterwards I felt awful, sending the Major round the back like that, and I said so to Lily at the trestle, and she laughed, and I said it that way to make a joke of it. I sent the Major round the back like a tradesman. That was all, miss. I never meant to. I mean, I never thought. You never thought it would matter. No, miss. It matters very much, Annie. I am going to ask you this morning to come with me to the parish hall and tell Inspector Slack exactly what you have just told me. Will you do that? Annie's eyes widened. He'll think I've held it back. He will think no such thing. You were not asked the question. You were asked many other questions, but not that one. You are not at fault for not having volunteered an answer to a question that was not shall come with you. We shall walk over together when the bread is in. I? Yes, miss. Yes, I'll come. Good girl. She left the kitchen by the side door. She stood for a moment in the side passage, the very passage the Major had used, and she observed without surprise that it gave directly onto the back lane, and from there onto the high street, exactly as a side passage in such a tea-room ought to. She walked next to the post office. Mrs. Paget was at the counter, already on her second cup of tea of the day. She looked up with bright readiness. "Miss Marple, have you heard? Inspector Slack has the Major's letter, the one from the drawer. He fetched it last night with a warrant. The whole village knows. Mrs. Paget, the letter Miss Marsden franked to the Major in April. The cream envelope. I should like you to be quite sure of one thing. Did you, at any time after that letter, see any other piece of correspondence pass between them, in either direction, through this office? Not one, Miss Marple. Not a postcard. I have been thinking on it since Monday. He never wrote back. He never wrote back. That is what I have been telling people. And he came here in those weeks, Did he behave at all unusually? Mrs. Paget considered. He came in for stamps on the Saturday after, I remember, because he was queer with me. Sharp, you know, the way he is when he is troubled. He bought a book of stamps, and he never used a one of them as far as I know, because nothing went out from the Grange for a month after. Not a single letter. The Major writes a great many letters, ordinarily. Thank you, Mrs. Paget. That is very helpful. Why, Miss Marple, is it the Major after all? It is not, Mrs. Paget. But I should not say so beyond this counter, if I were you, until the inspector has said so himself. Good morning. She walked back to the tea-room. Annie was at the door, in her coat, with her bread set to keep. They walked together to the parish hall. Inspector Slack received Miss Marple with the small, contained irritation of a man who had been expecting her sooner. He did not rise. He did not invite her to sit. He said, "Miss Marple, I had wondered when." "Inspector, I have brought you Annie Loft. She has remembered something. I think you will find it bears on Major Henshaw's presence at the side of the tea-room on Saturday." He looked at Annie. He looked at Miss Marple. He sighed briefly and pointed to the chair opposite his table. "Sit down, Miss Loft. From the beginning, please." Annie sat. She told her story. She told it well, clearer than she had told it in the kitchen, because Miss Marple's quiet presence beside her steadied her. The inspector took notes. He asked 1 or 2 questions. He asked her why she had not mentioned it on Monday. She said, with the small dignity of a country girl giving an honest answer, that she had not been asked and that she had not known until that morning that it mattered. The inspector sat back. He looked at Miss Marple. His moustache moved, very slightly, in the way it did when he was rearranging a case he had thought finished. "The lavatory. The lavatory, Inspector. And the burned letter at the Grange, that will have been Miss Marsden's, from April." "I should say so, yes. And the letter in his drawer, written Saturday morning, was—" "What, Miss Marple?" "A letter, I should imagine, that he had at last brought himself to write and not to send. A letter in which he said, after 30 years, what he had owed her the saying of. He kept it because, having written it, he could not bring himself to destroy it. It will read, I expect, badly in places, angry in places, because he is a man who confuses tenderness with temper. But it is not a murderer's letter, Inspector. It is the letter of an old fool who burned the wrong thing and kept the wrong thing, and who has lied about both because he is more afraid of looking ridiculous than of being suspected." Inspector Slack regarded her for some moments. "Miss Marple, if the Major did not do it, who did? Inspector, I shall be very glad to tell you. I should like to ask you first to leave the Major to the village's gossip and not to your charge sheet, and to give me until this afternoon. There is one conversation I must have. After it I shall come straight to you. I shall not, I promise you, withhold a thing." He held her eyes a long moment. Then he said, with the small dry honesty he occasionally permitted himself with her, "Miss Marple, the last time I gave you an afternoon, you were right." "Yes, Inspector." "Go on, then. This afternoon." "This afternoon." She rose. She thanked Annie. She went out into the bright cold morning, and she walked down the High Street toward the Old Mill tea-room for the last time. That, however, is the matter of the next part of our story. Miss Marple did not go to the tea-room that morning. She had said this afternoon to Inspector Slack, and she meant it. There was a rhythm to the tea-room's week that she had been watching for a fortnight, and on a Wednesday or a Saturday she would have had no clean hour with Sylvia Quinton. Thursday afternoon at 3, between the dinner trade and the 4 o'clock rush, was the quietest hour the place gave. She went back to Edith's. She sat with Edith through luncheon. Cold ham, pickled beetroot, a small piece of Mrs. Bunting's apple tart. And she did not tell Edith where she was going at 3. Edith, who was old enough to feel a weight in a room without needing it named, did not ask. She said only, as Miss Marple put on her coat, "Jane, you will be home for tea." "I shall be home for tea, Edith. Perhaps a little later than 4. Do not wait the pot." She walked down the lane in the pale, clear cold. The bell over the tea-room door gave its small domestic note. The room held 2 customers, a Mrs. Henley from the Salisbury Road, who came in on Thursdays for the seed cake, and an elderly man with a newspaper whom Miss Marple did not know. Sylvia was at the counter. Annie was not present. Miss Marple had asked her, in passing, whether Thursday was her half-day, and Annie had said yes. "Miss Marple, tea? A pot, please, Mrs. Quinton. China. And, if you can spare it, a moment of your time when you bring it. I should like to ask you something." Sylvia did not pause. She said evenly, "Of course," and turned to the urn. She brought the pot herself. She set it down. She set down the cup and the small jug. She did not at first sit. She stood by the table with her hands folded in front of her apron and said, in the same quiet voice, "What did you wish to ask me, Miss Marple?" "Mrs. Quinton. Will you sit, please?" "I had hoped to speak privately. I think the room will be ours in a moment." Mrs. Henley was paying. The man with the newspaper was folding it. They left within 2 minutes of each other with the bell and the bell. The door closed for the second time. Sylvia walked to the front, turned the sign to closed, and came back to the table. She sat opposite Miss Marple. She put her hands together on the cloth between them, the way she put them when she was waiting for an order to be settled. "Now," she said. Miss Marple poured her own tea. She did not look at Sylvia while she poured. "Mrs. Quinton, I should like to tell you what I believe happened, and I should like you to hear it through without speaking, and at the end you may say to me whatever you wish to say, or nothing at all. Will you do that?" Yes. In November of 1934, Helena Marsden left Marsham Bredy carrying your husband's child. She did not tell him. She did not tell anyone in this village except Beatrice Drake, who advised her to go and never to write. She went to Cape Town. She had a daughter there in the spring of 1935 and gave the child up to a placement in Rondebosch. She lived afterwards in Nairobi and on the south coast. Your husband Arthur married you, in good faith, in 1936. He died in 1937. He died, I am quite certain, not knowing that he had a child. He died loving you. He had, however, kept Helena's letters to him from the year before. He had kept 3. He had kept one in particular, from October 1934, in which Helena told him she was carrying his child and was leaving. Why he had kept that letter rather than burned. It is a thing I cannot answer for him. I should say only that he was the kind of man who could not destroy a thing of that sort. The keeping is, I think, the saddest part of the story, because the keeping has cost 3 lives, his, hers, and yours. Sylvia did not move. 11 months ago, I think, perhaps in your autumn clearing, perhaps a chance, you went up into the attic and found the box. You read the letters. You read the October letter last. You sat with it for a long time. You came down. You did not tell anyone. You did not, I think, even know yet what the knowing would do to you. It took, I should guess, 8 months for the knowing to find its shape. Helena came back to the village in April. She came to your counter. She ordered tea black with lemon. She mentioned her allergy in the offhand way she had mentioned it for 30 years. And the shape was given to you. Sylvia's eyes were on the tablecloth. You bought a peanut praline in Salisbury 8 weeks ago, from a delicatessen where you were not known. You paid in cash. You put it aside. You had on your shelf an almond praline, in a jar in your own hand, which you would use for the harvest tea scone. You emptied the almond praline jar to a little under the half the night before, into the river or into the kitchen bin. It does not matter which. You baked the scones on Saturday morning with the peanut praline. You disposed of what remained of the peanut jar before the tea opened. You put a card on the platter saying, "Contains almonds." You took Miss Marsden's bag from her at the door yourself, and hung it on the peg in the hall, which is why she knew, when she asked Annie for it, which peg. You knew Dr. Hargreaves would be unsteady at noon. You knew Miss Marsden's syringe was past its date because she had said so to you in June, in this room. You waited. She came in. She ordered the special. You served it to her yourself. You stood in the kitchen doorway with your hands folded in front of your apron, and you watched her die, and you were perfectly still. A long silence ran between them. The clock above the counter ticked. A coal shifted in the small fire at the back of the room. "Mrs. Quinton, the jar of almond praline is still on the shelf. It is half empty. You forgot it. It is the one thing you forgot. I saw it on Wednesday afternoon. I knew then that the death had been your doing. I did not, until last night, know why. I have spoken to Mrs. Drake. I have written to Cape Town. The London solicitor will, I expect, confirm by the end of the week that Miss Marsden had been preparing a will in favour of a daughter she gave up in 35, and had begun after 50 years to correspond with. She had come home to put right what could be put right. She had not come home to claim anything from you. She had not, I think, come home knowing that there was anything of you to claim from. She would not, very probably, have spoken of any of it in the village at all. Your husband took the secret of her with him. She would have taken the secret of him with her. You would have known nothing. You learned, by the accident of an attic, what was meant to die with 2 people who had already paid for it. And then you killed the 3rd person who had paid most of all. Sylvia at last lifted her eyes. They were dry. They were the eyes of a woman who had not been surprised by a single sentence Miss Marple had spoken. She rose. She picked up the teapot. She carried it to the kitchen. Miss Marple heard her set it down on the range. There was a small sound of a tap running and being turned off. Sylvia came back. She did not sit again. She stood by the table. "I thought it was a kindness, Miss Marple. To her, even, she had been carrying it for 50 years. You thought no such thing, Mrs. Quinton?" "No." A small pause. "I did not. I thought he had loved her. And I had been the second woman in my own house for 23 years and not known it. I thought she had come back to take from me what little I had left of him, which was the not knowing. I could not have the not knowing back. I could have her not being. It was the only thing left to take. Yes, how did you know about the jar? You served it once a year. Half a jar was missing on a Wednesday." Sylvia almost smiled. It was the smallest movement of the mouth. "I knew on Saturday night I had left it. I went down at midnight and stood in front of the shelf. I could not move it then. It would have been the moving of it that gave me away. I left it. I have been waiting since Sunday for someone to see it. I had thought it would be the inspector. I am glad it was you. Mrs. Quinton, I shall go to Constable Pike in the morning, Miss Marple. I shall ask you to leave me my evening. My son comes down at 6. I should like to give him his supper before I tell him. It is not a kindness I am asking for myself. It is a kindness I am asking for him." Miss Marple was quiet a moment. "You shall have your evening, Mrs. Quinton. Thank you." Miss Marple rose. She put on her coat. At the door she paused, with her hand on the latch, and she looked back. Sylvia Quinton was standing by the table in her clean apron, with her hands folded in front of her, perfectly composed, exactly as she had stood in the kitchen doorway on Saturday at 12:18. Miss Marple opened the door. The bell gave its small domestic note. She stepped out into Marsham Bredy and walked without hurry up the lane toward Edith's, and toward her tea, and toward the train home in the morning. That, however, what came after, and the daughter from Rondebosch, and Arthur Quinton's 3 letters in the attic that began it all, is the matter of the final part of our story. Sylvia Quinton walked into the constable's house at 9:20 on Friday morning, in her grey coat and her good hat, carrying a small overnight case. Constable Pike, who had been at his breakfast, rose with his napkin still in his hand. She set the case down by the door. She said, "Mr. Pike, I have come to tell you that I killed Miss Marsden on Saturday at the harvest tea. I shall make a statement. I have telephoned my son in Bristol. He will come down by the 11 train." Constable Pike, who had known Sylvia for 19 years and had eaten her scones every Sunday afternoon for most of them, sat down again very slowly. He sent the boy for Inspector Slack. Inspector Slack came within the hour. Sylvia made her statement in the small front parlour, in the same neat, unhurried voice in which she had always taken an order at the counter, and she signed it without a tremor. She was taken to Salisbury at 2 o'clock in the black car. Daniel Quinton arrived at 12. He was met at the station by the curate, who had been sent by Miss Marple. She had thought, rightly, that no boy should walk up the high street of his mother's village alone on such a morning. The curate brought him to Edith's cottage. Miss Marple sat with him in the parlour for perhaps half an hour. He did not cry. He asked one question only. Did she mean to do it, or did it come over her? And Miss Marple, who had thought about how to answer it on the walk back from the tea-room the night before, said, "Daniel, she meant to do it. She did not mean to be the woman who would do it. The distance between the two is the whole of what your mother has been carrying. You may, in time, find that you can carry some of it for her. You need not decide today." He nodded. He thanked her. He went to Salisbury on the 4 o'clock bus. He sold the tea-room in the spring. The new proprietress, a Mrs. Halliday from Devizes, repainted the cream and green a pale yellow, took down the shelf of jars, and renamed the place the Mill Café. The village did not, for some years, forgive her the yellow. Daniel moved his mother's belongings to Bristol, and put them in a small back room of his lodgings. He visited her in prison every second Saturday for the 11 years she lived. And he did not in all that time ask her the question Miss Marple had answered on his behalf. Major Henshaw was released on the Friday afternoon. Inspector Slack, to his credit, came to the Grange in person, and apologized, which the Major received with the small stiff dignity of a man who has been frightened and does not wish to show it. The letter from the drawer was returned to him. He burned it that evening, finally, in the same brick incinerator at the bottom of the garden where he had burned the other. He resigned from the parish council in November, citing his health, which was not in fact troubling him. He lived another 7 years. He did not, after Helena's funeral, speak her name aloud in the village again. Beatrice Drake came to Helena's funeral in dark blue, her gloves on, and stood at the back. She did not weep. She returned to her house, and was not seen in the village for 10 days. When she emerged she was, the village thought, slightly smaller. Not in body, but in some less easily named way, as though she had set down a thing she had been carrying for 30 years and had not yet adjusted to walking without it. She wrote that winter a long letter to a woman in South Africa whom she had never met. The woman in South Africa came in April. Her name was Margaret Bell. She was 52, a schoolmistress in Cape Town, married, with 2 grown children of her own. The London solicitor had written to her in October. She had written back in November. She had taken until April to decide that she would come. Beatrice Drake met her at the station. What they said to each other on the platform, nobody in Marsham Bredy ever knew. They walked up Church Lane together in the spring sunshine, and Mrs. Paget at the post office window saw them pass, and reported afterwards that Mrs. Drake had been carrying the visitor's case for her, and that the 2 women had been talking quietly the whole way, and that Mrs. Drake had her gloves off. They went first to Helena's cottage, which was now Margaret's cottage, and then to St. Bartholomew's, where Margaret stood for some minutes at her mother's grave. Beatrice Drake stood beside her at a small distance and did not speak. Margaret Bell stayed in the village a fortnight. She let the cottage to a tenant from Salisbury and returned to Cape Town. She came back every other summer for the rest of Beatrice Drake's life, which was 11 more years, and after Mrs. Drake's death she came less often, and after 1981 she did not come again. The cottage was sold by her son in 1986. The name Marsden disappeared from the village. Miss Marple left Marsham Bredy on the Saturday morning, 1 week after the harvest tea, on the 8:45 train from the small Wiltshire station where she had arrived. Edith stood at the parlour window with her stick and watched her go down the lane. Edith would write to her every fortnight for the next 4 years, and would die in 1968 in her sleep in the same parlour, of a heart that had simply, after 75 years, run out of reasons to continue. On the train, Miss Marple sat by the window with her knitting in her lap and the half-finished bed-jacket. She had not, after all, given it to Edith. She had decided to finish it properly first and post it from St. Mary Mead, folded inside her case. The train ran out past the downs and the wet hedgerows and the small grey villages of the Wiltshire borderland, and Miss Marple, who had not slept well, let her eyes rest on the passing fields without quite seeing them. She thought, as the train ran on, of Arthur Quinton, a postman of Marsham Bredy who had died in 1937 of a heart condition. A man who, in the year before he had married Sylvia, had been loved by Helena Marsden, and had loved her in return, and had let her go, and had let himself be loved by another woman afterwards, and had been, by all the village's account, a sweet and easily fond man and a decent husband. A man who had, in an upstairs box, kept 3 letters that he should have burned. A man who had not, in the 23 years of his marriage, ever quite been able to bring himself to destroy the evidence that there had been another woman first, because the destroying would have been the final closing of a door he had not, in his own heart, ever quite closed. If he had burned them, Miss Marple thought, all of them would still be alive. Helena, Sylvia, as the woman she was before October last year, Arthur himself as the man his wife had believed him to be. Then she thought, no, he could not have burned them. That is why he kept them. That is who he was. The train ran on toward London. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. The needles moved in the small, steady rhythm of 60 years of practice, and the pale blue wool grew, row by row, into the bed-jacket she would post to Edith in the morning. Outside reading, the rain began again. And that is the end of our story from Marsham Bredy. A story of scones and cream, and of a killer's scheme, and of 3 letters in an attic that nobody, in the end, could quite bear to burn. Thank you for listening to Marple Mysteries. Keep the kettle on. Until next time.